Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's, well, a little bit meta. We're going to be looking at how development cooperation can get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, trying to escape that reactive rut.
Exactly. Our source material for this is an article,
Pretty hard-hitting one, too.
it is, called The Reactive Reality, Why Development Cooperation Struggles to Get Ahead of the Game. And it really, I think, lays out the case that for all the talk, all the forward-thinking rhetoric, too much of the sector is stuck in a reactive mode.
Definitely stuck playing catch-up.
Right, instead of getting ahead of the curve. And I think one of the most striking examples they use is, remember the early days of social media?
Oh, yeah, Facebook, Twitter, everything felt so new.
It was such a revolution in how we communicated. But the article makes this point that, development organizations, a lot of them kind of missed the boat.
They really did.
Yeah.
I mean, here's this amazing opportunity for dialogue and real-time engagement, building relationships.
And what do so many organizations do? They just cling to their static websites.
Like it's 1999.
I know. I mean, the article even has this anecdote about a project lead who basically dismissed social media entirely because it wasn't what the client wanted.
Right.
Which makes you wonder, was it really the client or was it just easier to stick with what was familiar?
Just like they were afraid to take a risk, try something new. And the article really hits on that risk aversion. It's a big problem, that hesitancy to kind of break away from those established practices.
Yeah, even when it's like painfully obvious those practices aren't working. It makes me think like, are things really that much better today? I mean, are we past that now? Or are we still, kind of using social media as just a glorified website?
Right. Just another platform to broadcast information.
Not really leveraging that two-way potential.
Yeah, exactly. And sadly, the article suggests this reactive thinking. It goes way beyond just social media.
Oh, yeah.
They actually use they use migration as another big example.
Yeah. Right. It points out how for years people were sounding the alarm about, migration's growing importance, but those warnings were largely ignored. And then what happens?
Boom. The Syrian refugee crisis hits.
And suddenly everyone's scrambling.
Development cooperation's left, trying to play catch-up yet again.
Right. And it makes you wonder, have we learned anything? I mean, are we any better prepared for the next migration challenge?
It's a good question. The article actually, it expresses concern that we might be heading right for another one of these reactive cycles.
Really?
Yeah. They point to tourism.
Tourism.
As a potential driver of future migration. Travel's more accessible, it's more affordable. You've got factors like climate change, economic disparities. It could all lead to just unprecedented levels of movement.
So are we just like sitting here waiting for another crisis to erupt?
That's the worry, right?
Yeah.
Always focused on putting out fires instead of preventing them. And this reactive mindset, it's not limited to, social media or migration, the article's saying. It's like it permeates the whole development sector.
Like, for example, they talk about the shift in focus from just calorie intake to thinking about nutritional quality in food aid. It took a long time for that to happen.
Yeah, it's like for years, it was all about just getting enough calories to people.
Yeah.
And as the article points out, it took way too long for the sector to kind of grasp, the broader picture of malnutrition.
Right.
Like obesity is a huge issue.
Absolutely.
But that whole idea of thinking beyond just calories, it was slow to catch on.
I mean, it shows you how much those old frameworks, those top-down approaches, really hinder progress.
Absolutely.
It's like we're trying to use an outdated map, And actually, speaking of outdated approaches, the article takes aim at what it calls the storytelling trap in development communications.
It's interesting, right? Because on the surface, it seems like a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, telling human stories.
Exactly. But the article says, often the execution just falls short. Like instead of getting those genuine narratives, the ones that really resonate, we often end up with these like overly polished, overly crafted stories.
Yeah, like a brochure with smiling faces.
Exactly. And, it feels more like marketing than anything else. It doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're trying so hard to showcase success that they lose that human element.
And it can backfire, I mean, audiences can tell when they're being sold something.
Right.
And it ends up undermining trust.
So how do we break out of this trap then? How do we move beyond the reactive, the risk-averse, these overly crafted narratives?
Well, that's where the article brings in this really interesting concept. They call it the overstory.
The overstory.
Yeah. And this is where it ties into, Malcolm Gladwell's work, the tipping point stuff. And he talks about the overstory being like that overarching narrative framework, the thing that really shapes our understanding of the world.
So, like the big picture.
Exactly. The lens we're using. And the article argues that, in development cooperation, often the overstory, even unintentionally, ends up reinforcing this narrative of dependency.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because we focus on the idea that, external aid is the solution.
Right. So it creates this sense that progress is only possible with outside help.
Right. And that even if we don't mean to, we could be undermining the people we're trying to empower.
So it's not just about telling better stories, it's about reframing that whole narrative.
Exactly. Shifting from that story of like us helping them to a story of genuine partnership, collaboration, shared progress.
So what should this new overstory look like? How do we even start to build a narrative that truly reflects the realities of development?
That's the big question, isn't it? Well, the article does offer, a few ideas to get us thinking. One is really looking closely at the narratives that we're putting out there, not just the individual stories, but that overall message.
Right. So it's not enough to just have a heartwarming story about a community that, benefited from a project.
Exactly. We have to ask ourselves, are we really highlighting the agency of the people involved, their resilience? Or are we kind of subtly pushing this idea that progress only happens because of external aid?
Right, because we could be, even with the best intentions, perpetuating a narrative that's actually harmful.
Yeah. So what does a more empowering narrative look like? I mean, how do we actually do this?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Well, for one thing, I think it means moving away from narratives that put the development agencies at the center.
Okay.
We need to be focusing more on the people, on the communities.
Putting them front and center.
Exactly. Giving them a voice, letting them tell their own stories.
But what about the donors? I mean, they want to see how their money is being used, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets, kind of tricky. We have to find ways to show impact without falling back into those narratives of dependency.
Right. So how do we do that?
Maybe it's about highlighting the ingenuity, the resourcefulness of local communities, showing how they're taking ownership, using the resources to build those sustainable solutions.
So instead of saying we built a well, it's the community came together to build a well.
Exactly. That slight shift in language can make such a difference in the message. And it can't just be about the successes either, right?
Right.
We have to be willing to share the challenges, the setbacks.
The messy stuff.
Exactly. That's what makes it real. That's what makes it relatable.
But will donors be okay with that? I mean, won't that make them less likely to fund projects if they see all the difficulties?
It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is a growing understanding that development is, it's complicated, it's messy,
Yeah.
and donors are getting more sophisticated too. They're looking for partners who will be honest, who are willing to, work through the challenges together.
So it's about presenting that more nuanced, more complete picture.
Yes. And that brings us back to that idea of reshaping the overstory, which is, that's a big task. But the article's saying it's essential.
If we want development cooperation to actually be effective.
Right. And if we want to move beyond this reactive approach and actually be proactive, we have to start by really looking at those narratives.
Yeah.
Challenging them, even if it means questioning our own practices.
Being willing to get uncomfortable.
Yeah. To really listen.
Because in the end, the goal isn't to create dependency.
No. It's about empowerment.
Helping people build their own futures.
Exactly. And that requires a real change in how we think about our work.
It's not just about being reactive or proactive. It's about being intentional.
Yeah.
Really understanding that overstory, it matters.
It really does. It shapes how people see things, how they act. It can make or break our efforts.
So are we ready to start rewriting the overstory?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a question we all need to be asking. Because if we're not shaping the narrative, someone else will.
And it might not be the narrative we want.
Exactly.
This whole conversation reminds me of something else the article touched on. It said that development cooperation is sometimes seen as kind of a sitting duck, vulnerable to all this criticism.
Yeah. Even calls to abolish it altogether.
Right. And maybe that's where this proactive approach comes in. Not just trying to predict the future, but really being willing to examine ourselves.
To be self-aware.
Yeah, and to be open to change.
Because if we're not willing to do that, if we're not willing to acknowledge the criticisms, we risk becoming irrelevant.
And that's why this whole conversation about the overstory is so important, right?
Right.
It's not just about, telling nice stories. It's about proving that development cooperation matters, that it's relevant,
And that we're not just reacting.
but that we're working towards a better future.
And that's a narrative worth fighting for.
Yeah, it really is. And to do that, to really fight for that narrative, we need to be honest about the challenges, the ones we face as a sector, but also the ones the world's throwing at us.
Oh, for sure. Development cooperation doesn't have a perfect track record. Let's be real.
Right. There have been mistakes, unintended consequences.
Always room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's where this idea of a proactive approach is so important. It's not just about predicting what's coming next,
Right.
but it's about being willing to constantly look at ourselves, our
Yeah.
methods,
Yeah, like question our assumptions.
even our motivations.
Absolutely. We need to move past that, we know best
Yeah.
attitude
Yeah.
and really embrace collaboration.
Which takes us back to that partnership idea, right?
Yeah.
Sustainable development, it can't happen if people don't have a voice, if they're not at the table.
And if those voices aren't truly heard, it's not about us coming in with the answers. It's about working together to find them.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say that development cooperation needs a pretty serious shift in mindset.
Yeah, from reactive to proactive, from
Yep.
top down to collaborative, from that old story of dependence to one of
In
partnership.
shared progress.
Exactly.
It's a huge challenge, but it's one the whole world needs to face.
And if we can get that over story right, if we can create a narrative that reflects that hope for a better world, I think we can actually make a difference.
Maybe, just maybe, we can stop playing catch up and get ahead of the game.
I like the sound of that.
Me too. But hey, that's a conversation for another deep dive, right?
Let's save that for next time.
Exactly. So until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing for that better future.